The sobbing was the only sound on the deserted train platform. It was a raw, hopeless sound, swallowed by the vast Wyoming twilight. Deanna Bennett's tears fell onto the cold wood, freezing almost as soon as they landed. Her hands shook inside her thin gloves. Was it the cold or the terror? She couldn't tell anymore. The train was gone. Hours ago, it had chugged away into the distance, taking her last dime of hope with it. She had come to Cottonwood with a head full of dreams, a teaching position, a new life, independence. Now those dreams were shattered glass on a dusty floor. The job she'd crossed 1,000 miles for had been given to someone else. 3 weeks ago. No one had bothered to tell her. So, here she was, 22 years old, stranded, with just enough money for a single night's lodging and not a penny more. The sun finally died behind the mountains, and the platform plunged into a deep, predatory darkness. She was truly, utterly alone. Or so she thought. "Looks like you're having about the worst day a person can have." The voice came from the shadows behind her, a deep, slow drawl that sent a spike of ice through her veins. Deanna spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man stood at the bottom of the steps. He was just a silhouette, a tall, broad shape against the blackness, holding a single lantern that threw long, dancing shadows. He wore a long leather duster, and the brim of his hat was pulled low, hiding his face. All she could see was the hard line of a jaw covered in stubble. I'm fine," she stammered, the lie catching in her throat. The man didn't respond. He just started climbing the steps, slowly, deliberately. Each footstep was a heavy thud that echoed in the terrifying silence. He was like a hunter approaching cornered prey. As he got closer, the lantern light crept up his body, revealing more of him. Worn boots, dark trousers, and eyes. Eyes the color of a summer sky. Kind eyes, she thought for a half-second. But in the flickering lantern light, they looked as cold and empty as the vast plains around them. "No offense intended, ma'am," he said, his voice still low and even. "But you don't look fine." He set the lantern down on the step beside her, and the light illuminated her tear-streaked face. "Been sitting here for nearly 2 hours now." Deanna went rigid. The friendly tone was gone, replaced by something else, something calculating. "You've been watching me." "Not intentionally," he said, but it sounded like another lie. "I run the livery down the way." He gestured with his chin toward a large, dark building at the end of the deserted street. "Had business at the telegraph office. Noticed you when I passed by earlier." He was close now. Too close. She could smell the scent of leather and horses and the cold night air on him. "Figured you were waiting on someone," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "But the last train's gone, and you're still here." He took off his hat. Thick, dark hair fell across his forehead. "Isaac Thornton, at your service." He said the words politely, but there was no warmth in them. It felt like a formality before an interrogation. Her mother's warnings screamed in her head. Strange men in strange towns. But what choice did she have? "Deanna Bennett," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't offer her hand. She wouldn't dare. I arrived for the teaching position. It seems the position was already filled." Isaac's expression didn't change. There was no sympathy, no surprise. Just a quiet, unnerving stillness. "Ah, the school board," he said, his voice flat. "They're not known for their efficiency." It felt like he already knew. Like he knew exactly why she was here, crying on these steps. "And now I'm stranded," she choked out, a fresh wave of panic rising. "Nowhere to go. No money to get home." He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say a word. He just watched her. His blue eyes were like chips of ice, seeming to peer right through her, into her deepest fears. Then he sat down on the step beside her. He kept a respectful distance, but it didn't feel respectful. It felt like a predator, giving its prey a false sense of security before the final pounce. "Where is home?" he asked. The question was soft, but it landed like a stone. "Philadelphia," she replied, clutching her bag tighter, "where people are civilized enough to send a letter when plans change." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it never reached his eyes. "Cottonwood might not be Philadelphia, Miss Bennet," he said, "but it's got its merits." His gaze swept over the dark, silent town. "Good folks live here." He paused, and his eyes found hers again in the gloom. "Just takes them a while to show it." It sounded less like a reassurance and more like a warning. "Well, I won't be staying long enough to find out," she said, her voice sharp with fear. He ignored her completely. "And where exactly are you planning to go tonight?" he asked, his tone pointed. She opened her mouth, but no answer came out. The hotel would take every last cent she had. And then what? Starve on the street tomorrow? He knew. Of course he knew. He'd been watching her for 2 hours. He'd seen the desperation in every line of her body. "I thought as much," he said. He stood up, towering over her. Then he offered her his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, a hand that knew hard work, and maybe violence. "Look," he said, his voice shifting again, becoming smoother, more persuasive. "My sister Martha runs a boarding house just up the street. A good, respectable place." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She's always got room for a lady in need. And she'd skin me alive if I left you out here in the cold." Deanna stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a snake. "I cannot accept charity, Mr. Thornton." "It's not charity. It's being neighborly," he countered, his voice like silk. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow we can figure things out. Maybe talk to the school board." She knew with a chilling certainty that he had no intention of talking to any school board. This was a script, a performance, and she was the unwilling star. He glanced around the empty platform, then back at her. His expression was perfectly crafted to look earnest, sincere. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I know Cottonwood isn't where you plan to be, but for now, you're already home." The words were meant to be comforting, but they sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded like a sentence, a final, inescapable judgment. She looked at his face, trying to find a flicker of real kindness in those sky-blue eyes. She found nothing, just a deep, unreadable emptiness. But the wind was biting now, and the darkness felt alive with unseen threats. This man, this Isaac Thornton, was a threat she could see, and he was offering warmth, shelter, for one night. With a breath that felt like she was inhaling pure fear, Deanna Bennet placed her gloved hand in his. "One night," she agreed. His fingers closed around hers, strong and possessive. A gentle smile finally warmed his features, but it looked predatory in the lantern light. "One night it is," he said. As he led her away from the station, into the suffocating darkness of Cottonwood, Deanna knew one thing for sure. Her misfortune wasn't an accident. It was a plan, and she had just walked right into the heart of it. The boarding house was a stark white ghost in the moonlight. Green shutters looked like vacant eyes staring out into the night. Warm light spilled from the windows, but it didn't look inviting. It looked like the glow from a furnace. A piano played softly from inside, a lonely, mournful tune that did nothing to soothe her frayed nerves. "Your sister won't mind a late guest?" Deanna asked, her voice trembling as Isaac led her up the path. She was hyper-aware of his hand on her elbow, guiding her, steering her toward the front door. "Martha?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. "Woman's got the biggest heart in the territory." It was another line from his script. "Fair warning, though," he added, his grip tightening slightly as they climbed the porch steps. She'll likely try to feed you the moment you walk in." Before she could process the strange warning, the front door swung open. It opened so suddenly, it was as if someone had been waiting right behind it, listening for their approach. A plump woman stood there, her silhouette framed by the light from the hall. She had Isaac's same blue eyes, but hers were sharp, bird-like, and they darted over Deanna, assessing her from head to toe in a single swift glance. "Isaac Thornton, where have you been?" she snapped, her voice surprisingly harsh. Then her eyes landed on Deanna, and her expression changed in an instant. It was like a mask being lowered into place. Her features softened into a look of grandmotherly concern. "Oh," she cooed, "I didn't realize you had company." "Martha, this is Miss Deanna Bennett," Isaac said smoothly, stepping past her and pulling Deanna into the house. She arrived for the teaching position, the one that was already filled. He emphasized the last words, and he and Martha exchanged a look. It was a flicker of an expression, so fast Deanna almost missed it. But it was there. A shared secret. A silent understanding that made the hair on Deanna's arms stand on end. "Oh, you poor dear," Martha gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of pure theater. "Those buffoons on the school board. I told Hiram Wellesley they needed to send word." She stepped aside, her arms sweeping out in a grand gesture of welcome. "Come in, come in. You must be frozen solid." The warmth of the house hit Deanna like a physical blow, but it was a suffocating warmth, thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something sweet and cloying, like wilting flowers. The parlor was filled with people, but they were unnervingly still. Two old men sat at a chessboard, their hands frozen over the pieces. A young woman sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, the source of the sad music. They all looked up as she entered, not with curiosity, but with a quiet, knowing expectancy, like they had been waiting for her. "Everyone, this is Miss Bennett," Martha announced, her voice booming in the quiet room. "She'll be staying with us for a bit." "Only for tonight," Deanna corrected automatically, her voice small and tight. Martha waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that was both friendly and utterly final. "We'll talk about that after you've had some food," she said. She grabbed Deanna's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Miss Bennett, follow me to the kitchen. I've got stew still warm on the stove." Deanna was propelled down a hallway before she could protest. She glanced back at Isaac, a silent plea in her eyes. He just smiled, a cool, detached smile, and watched her go. The kitchen was large and warm, but it felt less like the heart of a home and more like a butcher's workshop. Pots and pans hung from the ceiling like instruments of torture, and a massive wood-burning stove dominated one wall, radiating an intense, oppressive heat. "Sit, sit," Martha commanded, pushing Deanna into a chair at a heavy wooden table. She ladled thick, dark stew into a bowl. It smelled rich and savory, but Deanna's stomach churned with anxiety. "When did you last eat?" Martha demanded, her eyes narrowing. "You're thin as a rail." "This morning," Deanna admitted. "Everyone calls me Martha," the woman said, slamming the bowl down on the table. "Been a spinster all my life. Prefer it that way. Gives me freedom." The word freedom sounded strange coming from her. Deanna picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She took a small bite of the stew. The flavor was intense, delicious even. But as she swallowed, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The heat from the stove intensified. "This is wonderful," she murmured, her voice sounding distant and muffled. Martha beamed, a wide, predatory smile. "Eat up," she said. Nothing helps a troubled mind like a full stomach. Just then, Isaac walked into the kitchen. He sat down across from her, his presence filling the already crowded space. "Room's all ready," he said. Best one in the house. Oh, I couldn't, Deanna started to say, but the words felt thick in her mouth. Nonsense, Martha snapped. It's available, and it's yours, for as long as you need it. But I can't afford. We'll work something out, Martha said, her voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial. Perhaps you could help around the house, in exchange for your lodging, until you sort things out. The dizziness was getting worse. Deanna looked from Martha's smiling face to Isaac's calm, unreadable expression. Why? She whispered, the question taking all of her strength. Why are you being so kind to me? Isaac and Martha exchanged that same look again. This time it lingered. It was a look of shared history, of a dark and complicated partnership. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice taking on a rehearsed storytime quality. 7 years ago, she began, I stepped off that same train. I had nothing but a trunk of clothes and a brother who'd come ahead to start a horse business. She sighed, a perfect dramatic sigh. First night here, I cried myself to sleep, convinced I'd made a terrible mistake leaving Philadelphia. Deanna's spoon clattered into the bowl. Her head was swimming. Philadelphia. You're from Philadelphia? She slurred. Martha nodded, her eyes gleaming in the lamplight. Born and raised on Spruce Street. Father was a lawyer. My family lives on Pine, Deanna managed to say. The room was spinning now. The edges of her vision were turning dark. Well then, Martha said, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. It seems we were meant to cross paths, doesn't it? Isaac's face swam before her eyes. He was smiling that same gentle smile. Cottonwood has a way of bringing the right people together, he said. The last thing Deanna saw before the darkness consumed her was the satisfied look on their faces. She had swallowed the bait, and now the trap was sprung. She woke up with a gasp. The room was dark, unfamiliar. Her head throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, who she was. Then it all came flooding back. The train station, Isaac, Martha, the stew, the drug. She sat bolt upright in the bed. She was in a small, cozy room, a blue room, comfortable bed, a washstand, a writing desk. It looked perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. But she knew it wasn't. She was a prisoner. She scrambled out of bed. Her legs were shaky, weak. Her traveling dress was gone. She was wearing a simple cotton nightgown. They had undressed her. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She ran to the door and twisted the knob. Locked. Of course, it was locked. She rattled it, her frantic movements making no sound in the thick, silent house. She ran to the window and tore back the curtains. The main street of Cottonwood lay below, bathed in an eerie moonlight. It was completely deserted. A ghost town. There were bars on the window, thin ornamental iron bars designed to look like a decorative feature. But they were bars nonetheless. She was trapped. Isaac's words echoed in her mind, no longer comforting, but terrifyingly literal. You're already home. She sank to the floor, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. They thought she was just another helpless girl from the city. Someone they could control. Someone they could break. They were wrong. She didn't know what they wanted from her. She didn't know what their plan was. But she knew one thing. She was not going to be their next victim. She would fight. She would find a way out, and she would make them pay for what they had done. As she huddled on the floor, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning, and for Deanna Bennett, the war for her survival had just begun. Dawn in Cottonwood was not a gentle awakening. It was a harsh, glaring light that seemed to expose every speck of dust, every hidden crack. Deanna was already awake when the knock came at her door. It wasn't a soft, cheerful knock. It was a sharp, commanding rap. Miss Bennett, are you awake? Breakfast is nearly ready? It was Martha's voice, artificially bright. The sound of a key turning in the lock sent a fresh jolt of fear through Deanna. She scrambled up from the floor, smoothing down the borrowed nightgown, trying to compose herself. She had to play their game, for now. "Yes, thank you," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be down shortly." She moved to the washstand and splashed cold water on her face. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of something else in their green depths. A hard, defiant spark. They had underestimated her. She dressed quickly in her second-best traveling dress, a deep blue wool. It felt like armor. She pinned her hair up, her fingers moving with a new, determined precision. When she descended the stairs, the dining room was full. The same boarders from the night before were seated around the large oak table. They all looked up as she entered, their faces polite, welcoming masks. "Ah, there she is," Martha exclaimed, beaming from the head of the table. "Everyone, this is Miss Deanna Bennett, our newest guest." The boarders murmured greetings. Deanna nodded, her gaze sweeping the room, trying to read their faces. Were they all in on it? Were they all part of this elaborate prison? She took the only empty chair, which was, of course, right next to Isaac. He wasn't at the livery. He was here, waiting for her. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice low. "Surprisingly, yes," she lied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your sister has been most gracious." "Martha's famous for her hospitality," Isaac said with a small smile. The conversation around the table was stilted, unnatural. It was a performance for her benefit. Mrs. Wilcox, the piano teacher, talked about the weather. Mr. Peterson, the chess player, complained about the price of grain. It was all meaningless noise, designed to lull her into a false sense of normalcy. Then the trap was laid. "So what are your plans now, my dear?" Martha asked, her eyes sharp. Deanna was ready for it. "I thought I might inquire about work in town," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Just until I can save enough for a ticket back east." A sudden, dead silence fell over the table. Everyone stopped eating. Everyone stared at her. It was Mr. Jenkins, the quiet man from the bank, who spoke first. His voice was deep and chillingly calm. "The position at the main schoolhouse is filled," he said, stating the obvious. He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But the settlement at Elk Creek lost their teacher last month, Miss Abernathy. She eloped with a cattle buyer." He said the words, "eloped with a cattle buyer," with a strange emphasis, his eyes fixed on Deanna. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. Elk Creek, another piece of the puzzle. "Where is that?" she asked, feigning interest. "About 10 miles north," Martha explained, a little too quickly. "Small community, mostly ranching families." "Do you think they'd consider me?" Deanna asked, injecting a note of hopeful desperation into her voice. She had to know what they wanted from her. She had to follow their script. "Only one way to find out," Martha said, her smile returning. And then came the final, closing move of the trap. "Isaac can take you out there tomorrow," Martha announced. "He delivers horses to the Whitman Ranch nearby every month." All eyes turned back to her, waiting, expecting her to agree. They were sending her deeper into their web, 10 miles north, further from the train station, further from any chance of escape. But if she refused, what would they do? Lock her in the blue room and throw away the key? She had no choice. She had to go to Elk Creek. She had to see what was waiting for her there. I'll think about it," she said, lowering her gaze to her plate. It was the right answer. It showed hesitation, fear. It made her look like the helpless victim they wanted her to be. After breakfast, she helped Martha clear the table. In the oppressive heat of the kitchen, Martha continued the performance. She talked about Philadelphia, about how she missed the theaters and libraries. "But then I started to notice other things," she said, her hands deep in the soapy water. "How folks look after each other here, without pretense. She handed Deanna a wet plate. One day I realized I hadn't thought of Philadelphia as home in months. This place, it worked its way into my heart. It was a beautifully delivered speech, a siren song luring her toward the rocks. I'm not sure I could ever feel that way about somewhere so rough, Deanna replied, playing her part. Just then, the back door opened, and Isaac stepped into the kitchen. He was no longer the shadowy figure from the station. In the daylight, he was solid, powerful. His work clothes couldn't hide the strength in his shoulders, the lean muscle in his frame. He looked directly at Deanna, his blue eyes intense. I heard there might be a teaching opportunity at Elk Creek, he said, his voice casual, but his gaze was not. Interested in riding out there tomorrow to inquire? He was testing her, pushing her. She had to seem reluctant. She had to seem broken. I'm not sure, she stammered. It seems so hasty. Isaac studied her for a long moment. Tell you what, he said, his voice softening, becoming persuasive again. Why don't we start with a visit to Mayor Wilson this morning? Get to the bottom of what happened with the teaching position here. Then you can decide. The mayor. Another player in their twisted game. Of course, they had to make it look legitimate. They had to make her feel like she had options, like she was in control. It was a brilliant, cruel strategy. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fake uncertainty. Yes, she whispered. That makes sense. Good, Isaac said, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He put his hat back on. I'll bring the buggy around in half an hour. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Isaac, he corrected himself, a charming smile playing on his lips. If we're going to Battletown politics together, we might as well be on familiar terms. He left. Martha stood by the sink, a knowing smirk on her face. What? Deanna asked defensively. Nothing, Martha said, her voice dripping with false innocence. Just thinking it's been a while since I've seen my brother so eager to play the White Knight. Deanna knew he was no White Knight. He was a wolf, and he was leading her straight into the woods. The ride through Cottonwood was like a tour of a movie set. Everything looked real, but Deanna knew it was a facade. The general store, the bank, the blacksmith shop. They were all just props in a larger, more sinister production. Isaac pointed them out, his voice a pleasant, steady drone. He told her which saloon to avoid, as if she had any choice in where she went. The people on the boardwalks nodded to him as they passed. Were they actors, too? Or were they just ordinary townspeople, oblivious to the darkness that lived in their midst? Everyone seems to know you, Deanna remarked, testing him. Hard not to in a town this size, he replied easily. Sooner or later, everyone needs a horse. His answer was smooth, practiced. He had an answer for everything. They arrived at the mayor's office, a small, unassuming building. Isaac helped her down from the buggy. His hand was warm and steady on her arm, but it felt like a manacle. The touch sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her, not a romantic tingle. It was the feeling of being in the presence of a predator. Mayor Harold Wilson was a fat, sweating man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He greeted Isaac like an old friend, but his eyes darted toward Deanna with a nervous, guilty energy. He knew. He was part of it. Miss Bennett has come all the way from Philadelphia, Isaac began, launching into the well-rehearsed story. The mayor played his part perfectly. He feigned surprise, then unfortunate regret. Miss Clarkson is already established in the position, he blustered, tugging at his tight collar. Deanna leaned forward, her own performance beginning. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured indignation. I sold my belongings. I traveled over 1,000 miles. The least this town can do is compensate me for my travel expenses, so I may return home. The mayor started to sweat even more profusely. Compensation, he stammered. That's a matter for the school board. Harold, Isaac interrupted, his voice suddenly hard as steel. The friendly mask was gone. Remember that situation with Thunderhead last spring? How I worked day and night to save that stallion of yours." The mayor's face went pale. There was the leverage, the dark secret. What had really happened to that stallion? "Of course," the mayor mumbled, eternally grateful. "Consider this a chance to return the favor," Isaac said smoothly, the threat hanging unspoken in the air. "All she's asking for is the fare back to Philadelphia." He was pushing the idea of her leaving. Why? To make the alternative seem more appealing? The mayor looked trapped. Then his eyes lit up, as if he'd just remembered his lines. "Actually," he exclaimed with phony brightness, "that reminds me. I received a telegram just yesterday from Elk Creek. They're in desperate need of a teacher." He turned to Deanna, his expression now one of greasy relief. "Their last one ran off with a cattle buyer. You're qualified, I presume." It was all so perfectly, horribly orchestrated. "You could take the position at Elk Creek while waiting for your reimbursement," the mayor continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The pay is decent. They provide housing. By the time the term ends in June, you'd have more than enough to go home." He was selling it hard. Too hard. Deanna glanced at Isaac. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. The two of them were a perfectly synchronized machine of deceit. "Elk Creek is a beautiful spot," Isaac said softly. "The schoolhouse sits right at the base of the mountains." They were closing the trap, leaving her with only one logical choice, the illusion of choice. She knew what she had to do. "I would need to see the school first," she said, her voice laced with doubt, "and meet with the families." Of course, the mayor boomed, barely able to contain his relief. "I'll send word today. Thornton, you could take her out there, couldn't you? Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Isaac confirmed, his eyes locking with Deanna's. The decision was made for her. As they left the mayor's office, Deanna felt a strange coldness settle in her stomach. She had come to Wyoming for a job. She had been given a role in a nightmare instead. "You must think me terribly fickle," she said to Isaac as they climbed back into the buggy, "considering staying after I was so determined to leave." Isaac clicked to the horse, his profile hard against the bright Wyoming sun. "Not fickle," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Adaptable. That's a valuable quality out here." He turned to look at her, and for a second, the mask slipped. His blue eyes were cold, assessing. "The West has a way of changing a person's plans, Deanna," he said. It was not an observation. It was a threat. "Sometimes for the better," he added, the smile returning to his face. But it was a dead, lifeless thing. He turned the buggy toward the edge of town, toward his livery. He was going to show her his business, his domain. He was going to show her the cage he had built, just for her. The livery stable was bigger than she expected. It was a sprawling, dark structure that seemed to crouch at the edge of town, ready to spring. The sound of a hammer striking an anvil rang out, a rhythmic, violent beat. "Welcome to Thornton's livery," Isaac announced, a note of pride in his voice. Or was it ownership? He helped her down, and again his hand lingered too long at her waist. A casual display of possession. Inside the stable was a maze of shadows and smells. Hay, leather, and the heavy animal scent of horses. Stalls lined the walls, and the eyes of the animals within them seemed to watch her with a strange, sad intelligence. As if they knew she was the newest addition to his collection. A burly man with a massive mustache looked up from a saddle he was repairing. "Jake, this is Miss Deanna Bennett," Isaac said. "Deanna, this is Jake Hollister, my right-hand man." Jake just grunted, his eyes hostile as they swept over her. He was another one, another guard in this sprawling prison. Isaac led her deeper into the stable, pointing out horses, talking about bloodlines and temperaments. His voice was calm, but his words were a display of power, of control. He stopped before a stall at the very back of the stable. Inside was a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished jet, even in the dim light. The horse was pure muscle and contained energy, its eyes wild and intelligent. "This is Midnight," Isaac said, his voice softening with genuine affection. The horse approached him, nudging his hand. "He's special," Isaac murmured, stroking the stallion's powerful neck. "Saved him from a cruel owner 2 years ago. Wasn't sure he'd ever trust humans again." It was another story, another performance. Deanna watched his hands on the horse, strong, capable hands, hands that could gentle a wild animal or break a woman's spirit. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the vast stable. "Would you like to pet him?" Isaac asked, turning to her. He was standing so close she could feel the heat of his body. "He's cautious with strangers," he added, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "But he can sense a good heart." He was mocking her. She hesitantly extended her hand. The stallion watched her, its nostrils flaring. It took a step back, its eyes rolling in fear. "He doesn't seem to like me," she said. Isaac chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "He just needs to get used to you," he said. "Give it time." Their eyes met over the stall door. The air crackled with a sudden, terrifying intensity. He wasn't just talking about the horse anymore. He was talking about her. He was telling her that she would get used to her cage, that she would learn to accept her fate. Just then, Jake's voice boomed from the front of the stable. "Isaac, that Army lieutenant is here about the horses for Fort Laramie." Isaac's head snapped up, his expression hardening. He turned away from her, his attention instantly shifting. "Duty calls," he said, his voice clipped. "Would you mind waiting in the office? This won't take long." It wasn't a request. It was an order. She watched him stride away, a man completely in his element, a king in his dark, dusty kingdom. The office was a small, cluttered room. Ledgers were piled high on the desk. Bridles and whips hung from the walls. It was the nerve center of his operation. Through the dirty window, she saw him talking to the uniformed officer. Isaac was laughing, gesturing, a picture of a successful, respected businessman, a pillar of the community. But Deanna knew the truth. She saw the darkness under the charming smile, the violence coiled beneath the easy confidence. As she watched, her eyes scanned the cluttered office, searching for anything, a clue, a weapon, a way out. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a dark corner, half hidden behind a stack of old saddles, was a small, leather-bound trunk. It was a woman's traveling trunk, and on the side, just visible in the gloom, were the faded gold leaf initials. C.A. Deanna's blood ran cold. Miss Abernathy, the teacher from Elk Creek, the one who had supposedly eloped. Her first name must have been Charlotte, Clara. It didn't matter. What mattered was that her trunk was here, in Isaac Thornton's office. He hadn't just helped her disappear. He had taken everything she owned. He was a predator, a collector, and she was his newest prize. She heard his footsteps approaching the office door. She spun away from the corner, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. She had to get out. She had to get away from him. But how? Isaac walked into the office, a satisfied smile on his face. "All taken care of," he said cheerfully. "The Army is always a good customer." He looked at her, his smile faltering slightly as he saw the look on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She had. She had seen the ghost of the woman who came before her, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she wasn't careful, she would be next. The rest of the day was a waking nightmare. Isaac insisted on showing her more of the town. It was a tour of her prison yard. He took her to the general store, where the proprietor, a man with cold, dead eyes, showed her a small collection of books he called a lending library. They were all dusty, unread, more props. He pointed out the dressmaker's shop, the church with its peeling paint. Everywhere they went, people smiled and nodded. But their smiles were empty. Their eyes were vacant. It was a town of ghosts, and Isaac was their keeper. Supper at the boarding house was another performance. The boarders were eager to hear about her visit to the mayor. They all chimed in, selling her on the virtues of Elk Creek. "Good folks out there," Mr. Peterson, the chess player, said. "Simple living, but honest." The word honest sounded like a curse coming from his lips. "And the scenery is breathtaking," Mrs. Wilcox added. "The creek runs right through a meadow full of wildflowers. A beautiful, isolated place to bury a body." Isaac sat across from her, watching her, gauging her reactions. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying watching her squirm, watching the hope slowly die in her eyes. Later, he found her on the front porch. The night was cold and clear, the sky littered with a billion indifferent stars. "It's beautiful," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "One of the things I love most about Wyoming," Isaac replied, leaning against the railing beside her. "Out here under these stars, you realize just how vast the world really is." He was telling her how small she was, how insignificant, how easily she could disappear without a trace. They stood in a thick, heavy silence. Deanna could feel the violence simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He could snap her neck with his bare hands, and no one in this town of shadows would say a word. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She had to play her part. She had to survive until tomorrow. "A little," she admitted, her voice trembling just enough. "But also excited, I think." "That's a good sign," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Being open to possibilities is half the battle out here." She went to her room, her cell, and lay on the bed, fully clothed. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, replaying every moment, every word, every veiled threat. Who was Isaac Thornton? Was he a madman? A monster who preyed on lonely women? Or was he part of something bigger, something more organized? The whole town seemed to be in on it. Martha, the mayor, the boarders, even Jake, the stable hand. They were all puppets, and Isaac was the one pulling the strings. And Elk Creek. Elk Creek was the destination, the end of the line. What happened there? What had happened to Miss Abernathy? The questions hammered at her, but there were no answers. Only the cold, hard certainty that tomorrow she was being taken to a place from which she might never return. She thought about screaming. She thought about trying to break the window, but what good would it do? The house was full of her jailers. The town was their accomplice. No one would help her. She was completely, utterly on her own. As the moon crawled across the sky, a desperate, wild plan began to form in her mind. It was risky. It was probably foolish. But it was better than walking meekly to her own execution. Tomorrow, on the road to Elk Creek, she would make her move. She would fight. She would escape, or she would die trying. The journey to Elk Creek was a slow, deliberate march toward doom. Deanna sat beside Isaac on the wagon seat, her body rigid with tension. Every rock, every tree, every dip in the trail was a potential opportunity, a place to jump, a place to run. But Isaac seemed to anticipate her every thought. He kept the horses at a steady, unhurried pace. He never took his eyes off the trail for more than a second. His hands on the reins were relaxed, but she knew they could move with lightning speed. He talked, filling the silence with stories about the land. Tales of settlers and natives, of hardship and survival. They were cautionary tales, thinly veiled warnings about what happened to those who couldn't adapt, those who fought against the will of this harsh, unforgiving country. "How did you come to Wyoming?" she asked, trying to distract him, trying to find a chink in his armor. He told her a story about a friend from the war, a man named David Callahan who had died at Petersburg. He said he had come to Wyoming to deliver his friend's personal effects to his family. It was a perfect story. Tragic, noble, and completely unbelievable. He was a chameleon, a man who could be whatever he needed to be. A kind stranger, a successful businessman, a grieving friend, a cold-blooded killer. Deanna found herself sharing her own story, twisting the truth, feeding him the lines she thought he wanted to hear. She told him about her parents, her desire for independence. She painted a picture of a naive, idealistic young woman, someone easily manipulated. "I suppose that sounds terribly idealistic," she finished, glancing at him from under her lashes. "Not at all," he replied, his tone serious. "Idealism is undervalued out here. We need more of it." He was mocking her again. By midday, the landscape grew more rugged. The trail climbed into the foothills, the mountains looming over them like dark stone sentinels. The air grew thinner, colder. They were getting close. "Almost there," Isaac announced, a note of finality in his voice. "Elk Creek is just beyond that next rise." Deanna's heart began to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. It was now or never. The wagon rounded a sharp bend, the trail bordered by a steep drop on one side and a thick stand of pines on the other. This was it, her only chance. As Isaac guided the horses around the curve, she took a deep breath, braced herself, and threw herself from the moving wagon. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding in her shoulder as she rolled through the dirt and rocks. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain, and plunged into the trees. Branches whipped at her face, tore at her dress. Her lungs burned. She didn't look back. She just ran. She could hear Isaac shouting her name. She could hear the wagon grinding to a halt. She pushed herself harder, deeper into the forest, adrenaline screaming through her veins. She had a head start. He wouldn't expect it. She was faster than she looked. She ran until her lungs felt like they were on fire, until her legs were numb. Finally, gasping for breath, she risked a glance over her shoulder. There was no sign of him, no sound of pursuit. Had she done it? Had she actually gotten away? A wave of giddy relief washed over her. She leaned against a tree, her body trembling with exhaustion and shock. And then she heard it. A soft rustle of leaves just a few feet away. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Isaac was leaning against a tree, not even breathing hard. He was just watching her, a strange, almost pitying look on his face. He hadn't chased her. He had simply cut across the woods and waited for her. He knew the land. He knew where she would go. Her escape had never been possible. "That was foolish, Deanna," he said, his voice quiet, disappointed. He pushed himself off the tree and started walking toward her. She backed away, stumbling over a root. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice raw with terror. He kept coming. "We're almost there," he said, as if nothing had happened. "The Whitmans are expecting us." He reached for her. She did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. It was a primal, desperate sound that tore from her throat, echoing through the silent, indifferent forest. Isaac didn't even flinch. He just kept walking, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes as cold and hard as the mountains around them. Her scream died in her throat as a new, more terrifying thought struck her. What if there was no one to hear her? What if there was nothing out here but trees and rocks, and the man who was walking slowly, deliberately, to claim her? She was utterly, completely trapped, and her real nightmare was just beginning. Elk Creek was not a settlement. It was a compound. A dozen or so rough-hewn cabins were arranged in a tight defensive circle in a high mountain valley. A single muddy track served as its main street. There were no shops, no church, no sign of life, just the cabins, a large barn, and at the far end, a small white building with a bell tower. The schoolhouse. Her new prison. Isaac dragged her out of the forest and back to the wagon. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The rest of the journey was made in a dead, suffocating silence. As they approached the compound, figures emerged from the cabins, men with hard, weathered faces and cold, watchful eyes, women with tired, beaten-down expressions. They all stopped what they were doing and watched the wagon approach. They were all guards. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver in his hair strode out from the largest cabin. He had the look of a leader, a warden. "Isaac," he called out, his voice a low growl. "Right on time." "Always, Mr. Whitman," Isaac replied, his voice devoid of all warmth. He jumped down from the wagon and then pulled Deanna down after him. His grip on her arm was like iron. "This is Miss Bennett," he said, "the new teacher." Timothy Whitman's eyes raked over her, taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, the terror in her eyes. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Welcome to Elk Creek, Miss Bennett," he said. "We've been expecting you." A woman came out of the cabin behind him. She was thin and pale with the same empty eyes as the other women. This was Margaret Whitman. "Please come inside," she said, her voice a monotone. "You must be tired after your journey." Deanna was pushed into a dark, suffocating cabin that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. She was forced into a chair at a table. Coffee was placed in front of her. It was bitter and black. Children were brought out and introduced. 4 of them. They stared at her with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They knew what happened to teachers here. While Isaac and Whitman talked in low, hushed tones in the corner, Margaret Whitman explained the rules. "Fundamentals are essential," she said, her voice flat, reciting from a script. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. There will be no creative thinking, no impractical knowledge." Her eyes were dead. The life had been drained out of her long ago. "Our children need an education that will serve them in this life," she finished. "This life, in this valley, forever." Later, they took her to the schoolhouse. It was a single, grim room. The windows were boarded up halfway. The bookshelves were nearly empty. "The children made those shelves themselves," Whitman said with a note of pride. Of course they did. Child labor. Then they showed her the living quarters, a small, damp cell at the back of the building, a cot, a table, a chair, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were barred. "It's not much," Margaret said, "but it's secure." Whitman cleared his throat. "Now, about terms," he said. "School runs from September through June, but you'll be staying on through the summer, of course, for the harvest." It wasn't a teaching position. It was a life sentence of hard labor. "The salary is $40 a month," he continued. "But you won't be needing cash up here. We provide for all your needs. We'll keep your wages for you, in safekeeping." They were going to enslave her. He extended his hand. "So, do we have ourselves a teacher, Miss Bennett?" The question was a formality, a cruel joke. She looked at Isaac. He stood in the doorway, blocking her only escape, his face a cold, emotionless mask. There was no escape, no hope. If she refused, what would they do to her? What had they done to Miss Abernathy? With a heart that felt like it had turned to stone, she placed her hand in Timothy Whitman's. "Yes," she whispered, the word a death sentence. "You have a teacher." The rest of the afternoon was a blur. She was introduced to more of the silent, dead-eyed women. They told her about the quilting circle, a weekly indoctrination session. Whitman showed her the school register. 28 children, 28 young souls to be crushed and molded into obedient slaves. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of red and orange, it was time for Isaac to leave. He was returning to Cottonwood, to his comfortable life, to his role as the charming gatekeeper of this hell. He would go back and wait for the next lonely, desperate woman to step off the train. They stood by his wagon, the entire compound watching them. "You're all settled then," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she replied, her voice a hollow shell. I'll be out in a few weeks, he said. With supplies and the next mail delivery, he was her only link to the outside world, a link he controlled completely. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret? Pity? No. It was something colder. It was satisfaction. Deanna, he said, his voice dropping low. May I kiss you goodbye? He was mocking her, taunting her with a parody of the affection she had foolishly started to feel for him. He was showing her exactly what she had lost, what she would never have. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a pure, cold hatred. He stepped closer anyway. He cupped her cheek, his hand rough against her skin. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not tender. It was brutal. It was a brand, a mark of ownership. When he pulled back, he smiled. Welcome home, he whispered. Then he climbed into his wagon and rode away, leaving her alone in the twilight, surrounded by her captors, in the cold, silent prison of Elk Creek. As the last of the light faded from the sky, Deanna walked into the dark, empty schoolhouse. She ran her hand along the dusty surface of the teacher's desk. Her desk. They thought they had broken her. They thought she had surrendered. They were wrong. She was a teacher, and she had a lesson to teach the men of Elk Creek. A lesson in fear. A lesson in pain. A lesson in vengeance. School was about to be in session. The first week was a study in psychological warfare. Deanna taught the children by day, her voice a calm, steady presence in the grim schoolroom. She taught them their letters, their numbers. But with her eyes, she taught them something else. She taught them defiance. She met the gaze of the oldest boys, the ones whose spirits hadn't been completely crushed yet, and she held it. She saw the flicker of a question in their eyes, the spark of a rebellion they didn't even know they possessed. At night, she was locked in her cell. She explored every inch of the small room, searching for a weakness, a loose floorboard, a crack in the wall, and she found it. Under the cold, dusty hearth of the fireplace, one of the stones was loose. She worked at it every night, using a spoon she had stolen from the Whitman's cabin, her fingers raw and bleeding. Slowly, painstakingly, she loosened the stone, and one night it came free. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and inside that space was a book, a small, leather-bound diary. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. The first entry was dated 6 months ago. My name is Clara Abernathy, it began, and I am a prisoner. Deanna's blood ran cold. She devoured the diary, reading by the faint moonlight that filtered through the barred window. Clara's story was a mirror of her own. The promise of a teaching job, the arrival in Cottonwood, the charming, handsome stranger named Isaac Thornton, the drugged stew at Martha's boarding house, the terrifying awakening in Elk Creek. But Clara's diary contained more than just her own story. It contained the secrets of Elk Creek. The settlement wasn't just a prison. It was a business. A land-grabbing scheme, run by Timothy Whitman and a silent partner back in Cottonwood. They lured people in, teachers, farmhands, lonely widows, with the promise of a new life. They trapped them, broke them, and forced them to sign over the deeds to any property they owned back east. Isaac's job was to find the victims. Martha's job was to drug them. Whitman's job was to enslave them. And the silent partner? Clara didn't know his name, but she knew he was a powerful man, a man of the law. The last few entries in the diary were frantic, terrified. Clara had been planning an escape. A cattle buyer, a man named Henderson, had been passing through the valley. He had seen the truth in her eyes. He had promised to help her. The plan was to escape during the next supply run. The last entry was short, scrawled in a shaky hand. Henderson is here. Isaac is with him. Something is wrong. Isaac knows. Oh God, he knows. That was it. The diary ended. Deanna closed the book, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Isaac hadn't just brought her here. He had brought Clara here, and when she had tried to escape, he had stopped her. What had they done to her, and to the kind cattle buyer who had tried to help her? A cold, hard rage filled Deanna, burning away the last of her fear. She knew she couldn't escape on her own. She needed an army, and she was going to build one, right here in the heart of the enemy's camp. The next day, she began her real work. She started with Thomas Whitman, Timothy's oldest son. He was 16, full of a sullen, repressed anger. During the arithmetic lesson, she wrote a simple problem on the slate board. If a man builds a cage and puts 28 birds inside, how many birds must learn to fly before the cage will break? She looked directly at Thomas. He stared at the board, his brow furrowed. He didn't understand the math, but he understood the question. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw a flicker of life in his eyes. The revolution had begun. It started with whispers, a shared glance across the schoolroom, a question written on a slate and quickly erased. Deanna identified her soldiers. Thomas Whitman, the leader's son, simmering with resentment. Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, strong and silent with hands that could wield a hammer. And little Eli, the stable boy, who could move through the compound unseen and unheard. She fed them ideas, small seeds of rebellion planted in the fertile ground of their despair. She taught them history lessons about revolutions, about slaves who had broken their chains. She taught them geography, showing them maps of the world beyond their valley, a world they had been told didn't exist for them. She was arming them, not with guns, but with knowledge, the most dangerous weapon of all. One night, little Eli, her spy, brought her a message. He slipped a dirty, crumpled piece of paper through a crack in her door. Isaac is coming, 2 days. The time was now. She sent her orders back with Eli. A message for Thomas, a task for Sarah. The plan was desperate, a long shot, but it was their only shot. 2 days later, Isaac's wagon rolled into the compound. He looked different this time. There was a new woman with him, a beautiful blonde woman dressed in fine city clothes. She looked terrified. She was the new teacher, Deanna's replacement. Isaac was not just a gatekeeper. He was a conveyor belt, delivering fresh victims to the machine. A new, more chilling thought occurred to Deanna. What did they do with the old teachers? Isaac helped the new woman down from the wagon. His eyes found Deanna across the muddy yard. He gave her a cold, dismissive look. You are old. You are used up. You are replaceable. That night, the entire compound gathered in the Whitman's cabin, a celebration to welcome the new arrival. It was Deanna's chance. While everyone was distracted, Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, went to the forge. The fire had been kept banked and low. She brought it roaring to life. Thomas Whitman, using a key he had stolen from his father, unlocked the large barn. Inside were the settlement's horses, and its entire arsenal. A dozen rifles, locked in a heavy wooden chest. Little Eli, under the cover of darkness, moved from cabin to cabin. In his hands he carried embers from Sarah's forge, nestled in a small clay pot. Deanna stood at the window of her cell, watching, waiting. The plan was in motion. Then she saw it. A flicker of orange against the dark wood of the main barn. Then another, and another. Eli had done his work. The fires caught quickly, the dry wood of the cabins erupting into flames. Panic exploded in the compound. Men shouted, running from the Whitman's cabin, their celebration turning to terror. In the confusion, Sarah and Thomas broke the lock on the gun chest. They began handing out rifles to the other children, the ones Deanna had chosen, the ones who had found their courage. It was a children's crusade, an army of the damned. From the main cabin, Timothy Whitman emerged, his face a mask of rage. He saw the children with the rifles. He saw the flames licking at his empire. and he saw Deanna standing silhouetted in the window of the schoolhouse. He knew who had done this. He raised his own rifle and fired. The bullet shattered the window next to Deanna's head, showering her with glass, but she didn't flinch. The battle for Elk Creek had begun. The compound was chaos. Flames lit up the night sky, casting long, demonic shadows. Whitman's men were caught completely by surprise, trapped between the fires and an army of armed, angry children. Deanna smashed the rest of the window with her chair and climbed out. She ran toward the barn, the sound of gunfire echoing in the valley. Isaac was there, trying to lead the horses out of the burning structure. He saw her, and his face contorted with a rage that was terrifying to behold. He lunged for her. "You!" he roared. "You did this!" She dodged him, her heart hammering. "It's over, Isaac!" she screamed over the roar of the fire. "Let the people go!" He laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "This is my life, my business. You think I'll let a little school teacher from Philadelphia burn it to the ground?" He lunged again, and this time he caught her. His hands closed around her throat, squeezing, cutting off her air. Black spots danced in front of her eyes. This was it. He was going to kill her. Suddenly, a figure appeared behind Isaac. It was Thomas Whitman. He held a heavy fence post in his hands. With a guttural yell, he swung it, bringing it down with all his might on the back of Isaac's head. Isaac crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Deanna fell to her knees, gasping for air, her throat raw and bruised. Thomas stood over Isaac's body, his chest heaving. "It's not over," he said, his voice hard. "My father is still out there." Just then, Timothy Whitman burst from the smoke, his eyes wild with hatred. He saw his son standing over Isaac. He saw the betrayal. He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Thomas's heart. "You are no son of mine," he snarled. Deanna screamed. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Whitman's rifle. It came from the edge of the compound. Whitman staggered, a look of surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed on his chest. He collapsed to the ground, dead. Deanna and Thomas stared in stunned silence. Riders were pouring into the valley, dozens of them. They were led by a man with a silver star pinned to his chest, a U.S. Marshal. Behind him rode Jake, Isaac's stable hand. And beside him was the new woman, the terrified blonde from Isaac's wagon. But she didn't look terrified anymore. She looked furious, and she was holding a smoking pistol. The woman slid off her horse and strode toward them. "Is he alive?" she asked, nudging Isaac's unconscious form with the toe of her boot. Who are you?" Deanna stammered. The woman's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "My name is Charlotte Fleming," she said, "but you might know me by my maiden name, Watson." It was Charlotte Watson, Isaac's ex-fiancée, the one who had supposedly broken his heart. "What are you doing here?" Deanna asked, her mind reeling. "Finishing what my sister started," Charlotte said, her eyes blazing. She looked at Deanna, her expression softening for the first time. "My sister," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Clara Abernathy." The story came tumbling out, as chaotic and fiery as the night around them. Charlotte hadn't left Isaac for a banker. She had run from him. She had discovered his business, his partnership with Whitman. She had discovered what he was. She had tried to warn people, but Isaac was too respected, too charming. No one believed her. Her younger sister Clara had been more idealistic. She had refused to believe that the man her sister was supposed to marry could be a monster. So she had taken the teaching position in Cottonwood herself, determined to prove Charlotte wrong. And she had walked right into his trap. "When she stopped writing, I knew," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "I knew they had her." She had spent the last year trying to find proof. Her husband, the Denver banker, wasn't a fool. He was a powerful man with connections. He had hired detectives. He had petitioned the territorial government. They had finally convinced the marshal to investigate. Jake, the stable hand, had been their man on the inside, feeding them information. Their plan was to have Charlotte pose as the next victim to get inside Elk Creek and find the evidence they needed to bring the whole operation down. "We were supposed to come in tomorrow," Charlotte said, looking at the burning compound. "But we saw the fires from the ridge. We knew you'd made your move." She looked at Deanna, her eyes filled with a grudging respect. "You have more courage than I ever did," she said. The marshal and his men rounded up the rest of Whitman's followers. They were a pathetic sight, their power broken, their dark empire in ashes. In the main cabin, they found the ledgers, dozens of names, dozens of lives destroyed, dozens of stolen deeds, and in the cellar they found what they had been looking for, a shallow grave, 2 bodies, Clara Abernathy and the cattle buyer, Henderson. The silent partner from Cottonwood was also named in the ledgers. The circuit judge, Abraham Hollister, the man who had ensured that the law never came to Elk Creek. As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of the compound, the marshal's men led a chained Isaac Thornton to a wagon. He was conscious now, a large bandage on his head. He looked at Deanna, his blue eyes filled with a pure, undiluted hatred. He had lost everything, and it was all because of her, the young woman from Philadelphia who he had so tragically underestimated. The marshal approached Deanna. "You'll have to come to Cottonwood to give a statement, ma'am," he said. "After that, you're free to go. The territory will pay for your ticket back to Philadelphia." Philadelphia. The word sounded strange, foreign. A lifetime ago, it had been her only goal, to go home. But where was home now? She looked at the children of Elk Creek, huddled together, their faces dirty but their eyes shining with a new, unfamiliar light. Freedom. She looked at the schoolhouse, the only building left completely untouched by the fire. It stood there, waiting for her. She looked at Thomas Whitman, who stood beside her, no longer a boy, but a man who had faced down his own father to do what was right. She looked at the vast, beautiful, terrible Wyoming sky. This place had tried to kill her. It had tried to break her, but it had failed. It had forged her into something new, something stronger, something she had never known she could be. "I don't think I'll be needing that ticket, Marshal," she said, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "I believe I have a job to do." She turned and walked toward the schoolhouse. The children followed her students, her army, the first citizens of a new, free Elk Creek. The bell in the tower began to ring, its clear, defiant sound echoing through the valley. A new day had dawned, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Deanna Bennett was truly, finally home. The trials were the talk of the territory, the story of the Elk Creek slave compound, of the corrupt Judge Hollister, and of the brave school teacher who brought them all down, was printed in newspapers from Denver to San Francisco. Isaac Thornton and his sister Martha were sentenced to hang. The rest of Whitman's men were sent to prison for life. The stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners or to what was left of their families. Deanna stayed. With the help of Thomas, Charlotte, and her husband, she rebuilt Elk Creek. Not as a prison, but as a real town. A town built on a foundation of justice and hope. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of a fresh start. The schoolhouse filled with the sound of laughter. Deanna taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, of course, but she also taught them courage. She taught them to question authority. She taught them that no cage can hold a spirit that is determined to be free. She never went back to Philadelphia. She had found her purpose here, under the wide and endless Wyoming sky. She had found that sometimes the most beautiful dreams are the ones that rise from the ashes of a nightmare. And she had learned that the most important lessons are not found in books, but are written in fire and smoke and the unbreakable strength of the human heart. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next descent into the dark and twisted corners of history.